Roselyn Colwell pressed her back against the cold wall of the mill's counting house, her father's account book still open in her arms, and listened to her husband explain to her oldest friend precisely how long he had been planning to take everything from her. She had come early that Wednesday morning the way she always came early, before the looms started, before the foreman arrived to open the office, before the day's noise made thinking impossible. The counting house sat at the far end of the Vayne textile mill's ground floor, separated from the weaving room by a short corridor and a heavy door that someone had left slightly open. She had been reaching for the handle when she heard Gareth's voice, and then Mirabelle's, and the particular quality of intimacy between them. The low, unhurried tone of two people speaking in a room they were certain was empty. She stood exactly where she was. The deed transfer, Gareth was saying, will take her signature and nothing more. Once it's executed, the mill passes to my name under standard marital property law. She won't contest it. She is not the contesting type. Mirabelle's voice was softer. But she works here every morning. She knows the accounts. Gareth was quiet for a moment. Then, that's the useful part of marrying a practical woman. She trusts competence. She trusts process. She's been watching me manage the shipping accounts for 14 months without a single irregularity. So when I present the deed as a consolidation measure, she'll read it and she'll sign it. Because nothing about my behavior has given her cause to read between the lines. She heard the scrape of a chair. The woman does not love me, Mirabelle. She has never pretended to. The arrangement was her cousin's introduction at her father's ledger, and she married me because she needed a capable manager, and the county doesn't recognize a woman's right to hold mill contracts independently without challenge. He paused again, shorter this time. That absence of love is the thing that makes this manageable. A woman who loves her husband watches his face. A woman who respects only his competence watches his work. She has been watching my work. She has not seen me. Roselyn stood in the corridor and breathed. She breathed the way her father had taught her to breathe when something was happening that required her full intelligence rather than her full feeling. Slowly, through the nose, counting the exhale. First, her father had told her once, when she was 11 years old and had made a significant error in the cotton weight ledger and had begun crying before she understood the full extent of it. First you understand what happened. Then you decide what to do about it. She understood what had happened. She began to decide what to do about it. The Vayne mill had been her father's before it was hers. Leonard Vayne had built it over 23 years on the Charleston waterfront. Not with inherited money, which he hadn't had, but with the particular kind of methodical stubbornness that accumulates slowly and compounds quickly. He had started with 2 looms and a lease on a building that flooded every third spring, and by the time Roselyn was old enough to read the accounts alongside him, he had 40 looms, 3 river contracts, and the loyalty of every cotton grower within 40 miles, who valued a buyer who paid exactly what he said he would pay, on exactly the day he said he would pay it. He had died in the autumn of 1847, quietly, in the armchair by the mill office window, reading correspondence. Roselyn had found him. She had been 26 years old. The mill had been left entirely to her, which surprised no one who knew Leonard Vayne and surprised everyone else. He had no sons. He had not treated that as a deficiency. He had treated it as a variable that required adjusting for, and he had adjusted, methodically, over decades, by making certain his daughter knew every line of every contract, every weakness in every lease, every man in every county whose handshake meant something, and every man whose signature meant less than his handshake. What Leonard had not accounted for was the law. Not the spirit of it, which he had believed in completely, the letter of it. In South Carolina in 1847, a woman could inherit a business. She could not, without a male guarantor, hold the primary contracts that connected that business to the state's largest cotton brokerages. She could manage the mill. She could not sign the documents that made the mill economically viable at scale. Roselyn had known this. Her father had known this. They had discussed it, in the last year of his life, with the specific discomfort of 2 people who understand a problem clearly and find it deeply unreasonable. Her cousin Prosper Vayne, who was 34 and had made and lost 2 modest fortunes in bad land speculation, had offered a solution. He knew a man, he said. A man named Gareth Colwell, recently arrived from Raleigh, with a background in textile brokerage and a reputation, Prosper said, for honest dealing. Gareth was 33, unmarried, and understood exactly what this arrangement would be. A professional partnership given legal form through marriage. He was not romantic about it. Neither was Roselyn. They had met 4 times before the ceremony. Gareth had asked intelligent questions about the river contracts. He had not talked down to her. He had taken notes when she explained the pricing structure for the spring cotton harvest. She had thought that was something. It had been, she now understood, a performance designed to make her think it was something. She had perhaps 45 minutes before Gareth finished in the counting house and came looking for her. She did not go back through the mill entrance. She went around the side of the building to the yard where Roscoe Tanner was already supervising the morning delivery of raw cotton bales, clipboard in one hand, coffee in the other, squinting against the October sunrise with the particular expression of a man who has done the same work for 22 years and finds it no less demanding for the familiarity. Roscoe had served her father before he served her. He had known Roselyn since she was 8 years old and first appeared in the mill yard under Leonard's supervision, asking questions that startled the delivery drivers. He was 51 now, with broad shoulders gone slightly soft and a memory for weights and measures that no ledger could fully replace. She pulled him away from the delivery, quietly, toward the far end of the yard. "The deed transfer," she said. "The one Mr. Colwell mentioned last month. The consolidation of the mill contracts under a single holder. Has he discussed it with anyone outside the family?" Roscoe was quiet for a longer time than the question required. She noticed. "There was a man," he said. "3 weeks ago, on a Thursday. He came from Augusta. Said he was here to value the equipment. A general assessment, Mr. Colwell told me. I showed him the looms. He asked about the river access and the brokerage contracts, which I thought was an unusual thing for an equipment assessor to ask." He paused. "I wrote it down. I write everything down. Your father asked me to do that when I started, and I've never stopped." Roselyn looked at him steadily. "What else did you write down?" Roscoe reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a small notebook. He held it for a moment, the way a man holds something he has been keeping, in case a day like this one arrived. "I kept copies of the correspondence," he said. "The letters that came through the mill office. Your father's instruction was that copies of all business correspondence went into the files. Mr. Colwell changed the filing system 8 months ago, said it was more efficient. But I kept my own copies." He held out the notebook. "I kept them because something felt wrong, Mrs. Colwell, and I didn't have a name for what it was yet." He paused. "I'm sorry I didn't bring it to you sooner. I was waiting for the thing I couldn't name to name itself." She took the notebook. She read it standing in the yard, while the cotton bales were unloaded around her. The letters were between Gareth and her cousin Prosper. They went back 14 months. 2 months before Gareth had appeared in Charleston. 4 months before Prosper had introduced him. The language was careful in the early letters, the way careful men write when they are designing something that must not look designed. By the 6th letter it was less careful. Prosper had written, "The mill alone is worth the effort. The river access is the second prize. Combined they represent more in annual income than either of us will see otherwise." Gareth had written back, "She will be cooperative as long as the marriage functions without disruption. She is not sentimental, that is the advantage. She is not sentimental, that is the advantage." Roselyn folded the notebook and held it against her side. "The man from Augusta," she said. "Do you know which widow he worked for?" Roscoe said a name. "Odette Hale." He said it carefully, the way you say the name of someone you know to be a cautionary story. "I heard afterward that Mrs. Hale lost a cotton warehouse in a marriage some years back, a husband who came with recommendations and left with the deed." Roselyn said, "Can you reach her today?" Roscoe looked at her steadily. "I can have a rider out within the hour." "Do that. Tell her what I've told you, and that I may need her account in writing before the end of this week." He was already moving. That evening, Gareth hosted a business dinner. He had arranged it 3 weeks prior. 12 men, the principal cotton brokers and 1 county commissioner, whose signature appeared on 3 of the mill's key operating agreements. Roselyn had been told it was a cultivation dinner, an evening to strengthen relationships she could not herself cultivate, because the men involved did not do business with women directly. She had accepted this the way she accepted most of what Gareth managed, as something outside her designated role, in the category of things that seemed functional. She understood now that this dinner was not about cultivation. It was about Gareth presenting himself, over roasted duck and good wine, as the primary principal of the Vayne mill, so that when the deed transfer was completed next week, no one at this table would be surprised that his name was on the document. She dressed for dinner without saying anything to Gareth about what she had found. She wore the deep blue dress that had been her mother's color, and which Leonard had kept a portrait of beside the mill ledger on his office wall. She wore the cameo brooch her father had given her the day she turned 21, when he had formally put her name on the brokerage correspondence. She looked like what she was, the daughter of the man who built everything these men were here tonight to discuss. The dinner began without incident. Gareth was smooth and warm and attentive, the way he always was in company. One of the things she had once thought meant something, and now recognized as the particular polish of a man who had been charming people his entire adult life with practiced efficiency. He introduced her to two brokers she hadn't met. She spoke briefly about the spring cotton yields. She was pleasant. She watched his shoulders relax as the first course cleared. He thought she was playing her role. She waited until the third course. Then she set down her fork, touched her napkin to her mouth and stood. Gareth looked up. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not alarm yet, only the beginning of attention. "I need to share something with our guests before this dinner continues," she said. Her voice was even. It carried to the far end of the table without difficulty. 12 men went quiet in the way men go quiet when a woman says something at a table they expected her to quietly decorate. She reached into the interior pocket she'd had put into the dress 3 years ago over the seamstress's objections, and produced the first letter. She laid it on the table beside her place setting. "My husband introduced himself to this room as the managing principal of the Vayne mill," she said. "I would like to tell you how he came to that position." She looked at each face in turn. "My father, Leonard Vayne, built this mill over 23 years. He left it to me. In order to hold the primary brokerage contracts without legal challenge, I required a male guarantor. My cousin introduced me to Mr. Colwell as a trustworthy partner." She set a second letter on the table. "These letters are between my husband and my cousin, beginning 14 months ago. 4 months before I met either of them in the same room. They describe a specific plan to gain control of the mill's deed through a marriage, a deed transfer executed under the pretense of administrative consolidation, and the subsequent use of a creditor arrangement to transfer effective control to my cousin." She said it without heat. The way her father had said difficult things. Straight through, no decoration, with the implicit respect of believing the people listening could handle the truth. The county commissioner, a man named Halford, who had known Leonard Vayne for 15 years, leaned forward and picked up the nearest letter. "Roselyn." Gareth's voice was controlled. "This is a misunderstanding of some private correspondence that—" "I also have," Roselyn said, "an account from a widow in Augusta, who married a man using this same arrangement several years ago. She lost her cotton warehouse. The man who assessed this mill's equipment 3 weeks ago works for the brokerage that acquired it." The sound that went through the table was not loud. It was the sound of 12 men who understood property and contract and the specific mechanics of what had almost happened, processing that understanding simultaneously. Gareth went very still. He looked at her. She looked back. She saw the moment when he performed the calculation he had always performed, the rapid accounting of what each face in the room meant, what each man's response cost or provided. And she saw the moment when the accounting came back wrong. All wrong, there was no angle left. He picked up his hat from the stand by the door. He walked out. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Commissioner Halford set down the letter and said, in the measured way of a man who has been adjudicating disputes for 20 years, "Mrs. Colwell, I believe I need to read these in full." "Please," she said, and she sat back down. She found Mirabelle in the upstairs sitting room, which was where Mirabelle always retreated when the house felt difficult. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, and an expression that had been preparing for this conversation since morning. Roselyn sat across from her. She looked at the face she had known since girlhood, at the familiar shape of it, the downward cast of it now. She felt the weight of 20 years of friendship pressing down on her, and she acknowledged it fully, the way she acknowledged every cost before she paid it. "I heard you this morning," she said, "in the counting house." Mirabelle's chin dropped. She pressed her hand over her mouth. "I found a letter," Mirabelle said at last, 3 weeks ago. "A letter from Prosper that told me what the deed transfer actually was. I knew at that point what I was part of." She stopped. "I didn't know at the beginning. He told me it was a business arrangement, that you'd agreed to it, that the consolidation was your idea." "At what point did you understand it wasn't?" 3 months ago. She met Roselyn's eyes directly for the first time. "When I heard him describe how he'd structured the marriage to ensure you wouldn't contest it." You said nothing. I was afraid, Mirabelle said. I was afraid of what I'd already allowed. She paused. I don't have an excuse. I want you to know I'm not offering one. Good, Roselyn said, because I'm not in a position to accept one. She stood. She looked at Mirabelle for a long time, at the woman who had been her closest confidence for 20 years, who had known her father, who had sat with her the night he died and said nothing that was false. She thought about all of it and set it down, cleanly, the way you set down something you understand you can no longer afford to carry. You will leave the house this week, she said. I will give you a letter for 2 families I trust, and I will not speak publicly of your role in this. But I cannot have you here, you understand that. Mirabelle nodded. She said, I do. Roselyn walked out. Odette Hale arrived from Augusta 2 days later. She was 40 years old, with the posture of a woman who had been through something that had stripped away every unnecessary thing and left only what was load-bearing. She came with her court documents in a leather satchel and the particular directness of a person who has spent years waiting for an invitation that finally arrived. I lost the warehouse in 1844, she told Roselyn, in the mill office with the door closed. The man's name then was not Colwell, but the structure was the same. An arranged introduction from a mutual contact, a marriage on the grounds of business necessity, the deed transfer framed as a consolidation, the creditor arrangement afterward. Did you contest it? For 2 years, I lost. The transfer had been signed voluntarily and legally. My signature was on the document. Roselyn looked at her steadily. Would you be willing to give a sworn statement to the county court? Odette said, I came here for exactly that purpose. She paused. Mrs. Colwell, I did not have what you have. I didn't have a Roscoe Tanner who kept copies of correspondence. I didn't have a commissioner at my dinner table. She met Roselyn's eyes with the same even directness she had used throughout. I want you to know that what you did matters beyond your own case. Men like this one are not singular. They find the same gaps in the same laws, and they use them until something stops them. Then let's make sure this stops him, Roselyn said. She sent for Commissioner Halford. The legal proceedings took 3 months. Gareth was located in Richmond. He had not gotten as far as he might have hoped, which Roscoe attributed to the fact that all 3 of the Vayne Mills horses had been quietly moved to the back pasture the previous afternoon. He was brought back to Charleston to face the formal complaint. Prosper Vayne was staying at the Merchants Hotel on East Bay when Roselyn went to find him. He made 2 attempts at denial before she placed his own letters on the table between them. The 3rd attempt died partway through. He looked at his name on the paper, in his own handwriting, with the comfortable specificity of a man who had planned something very carefully and believed he had thought of everything, and said nothing for a long moment. He cooperated. Roselyn did not forgive him, which she understood was a distinction he might not appreciate, but which mattered to her. She asked for 3 things: a full written account, any documents he held relating to the Vayne estate, and a sworn statement that he would make no further claim against the mill or its operations. He signed, with the pen held very straight and the face of a man who has arrived at the end of a plan and found someone else standing there already. Odette Hale gave her testimony on a Tuesday morning in January, standing in the county court and speaking in the same clear, even voice she had used in the mill office. She spoke for 40 minutes. When she sat down, the room was quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when something true and costly has been said, and everyone present understands its weight. Gareth Colwell was found guilty on the primary counts of fraud and conspiracy. He lost his right to enter into property-related legal agreements in South Carolina for 15 years. Prosper received a lesser finding in exchange for his cooperation, along with a financial penalty and the permanent sworn record of his admission, which meant that any future maneuver against the Vayne estate would be immediately compromised by his prior confession. The proceedings also surfaced, through documents Prosper surrendered, 2 additional arrangements Gareth had attempted with other men in Virginia. Roselyn forwarded everything to the appropriate courts. She wrote letters to both women identified in those cases. One wrote back within a week. The other took a month, and her letter was 4 pages long. Roselyn read every word of each one twice, in her father's office, with the account ledger open in front of her, because she found she could not read certain things sitting still without something solid to hold. The mill expanded in the year that followed. The spring cotton contracts went out under her name alone. Commissioner Halford had moved the appropriate measure through committee, which did not solve the underlying law, but created a workable precedent for established mills with documented operating history. Slower than Roselyn would have liked, and better than what had existed before. She negotiated 3 new brokerage agreements herself, sitting across the desk from men who had been at the October dinner, who had watched her stand up in the middle of a business evening and lay out the structure of a fraud with the precision of a woman who had grown up reading mill contracts by lamplight. They gave her better terms than they had given Gareth. She noted that in the ledger without comment. She hired 2 people for the counting house. One had worked the Augusta cotton routes and could read the river schedules better than anyone Roselyn had encountered. The other was a young woman who had been keeping accounts for her family's dry goods store since she was 14 and who, Roselyn had heard through the particular efficient network of people who pay attention to competence, was not being paid what she was worth. Roselyn trained them both the way her father had trained her, with patience, with specificity, and the steady expectation that they would eventually know more than she did, because that was the point. Odette Hale went back to Augusta in the spring. She and Roselyn wrote to each other regularly. Not long letters, not the detailed correspondence of women with nothing else to do, but the efficient, warm, specific letters of 2 busy people who have decided the connection between them is worth the time it costs. Roscoe Tanner remained in his office at the far end of the mill floor, with his clipboard and his notebook and his unbroken 22-year record of writing everything down. Roselyn had told him, the week after the dinner, that she did not intend to hold his silence against him. She told him that some things take time to name, and that the important thing was what he'd done when it named itself. He had nodded once, with the precise brevity of a man who understood that some things required no more words than they required, and gone back to work. She had told him one more thing. She told him that anything he noticed, any inquiry, any irregularity, any conversation he thought twice about afterward, came to her desk immediately, not to protect her from worry, not to wait for better evidence, to her desk, and she would decide what it meant. He kept that promise without exception. The mill office still smelled like her father's work. Old paper and raw cotton, and the faint machine oil residue that had accumulated in the wood grain over decades, which Roselyn had stopped trying to clean out because she had decided it was not a thing she wanted to lose. She sat at Leonard's desk every morning before the looms started, going through the accounts and the correspondence and the day's scheduling, which was the same work she had done alongside him since she was old enough to read the numbers, and which was now entirely hers. On a Thursday, in October, exactly a year after the morning she had stood in the corridor with her father's account book in her arms, she opened the mill's quarterly ledger and found the year's final figures waiting. The numbers were good. They were, if she was being honest with herself, the best the mill had posted in 12 years. She wrote that down, not because she needed to, because her father had taught her that the things worth keeping should be documented, and that the work of a well-run life was not merely to survive the bad years, but to be able to look clearly at the good ones, and understand precisely what had built them. A well-run life, Leonard Vayne had told her once, is not about protection. Protection is what you do when you're afraid. A well-run life is what you build when you understand exactly what you have, exactly what it's worth, and you decide, with full information and full intention, to grow it. Roselyn Colwell closed the quarterly ledger. She picked up her pen. Outside, the looms were starting. She could hear the particular rhythm of them, the sound that had been the background of her entire life, that had been her father's sound before it was hers. She had grown up breathing it. She intended to grow old in it. She began to write.